Well, good morning, everybody. Many familiar faces, which is lovely to see you again, and those who I don't know, great to meet you, and I look forward to talking with you later. I have strange memories of this particular theatre, or one very similar to it at Auckland, because years ago they invited me up to give a lecture to the second year medical students, and the hall was pretty full, but there was a group at the back who very ostentatiously read their New Zealand Heralds throughout the whole lecture, basically telling me that because it wasn't in the exam, they weren't the slightest bit interested in anything I was likely to tell them. And that is actually part of what I'm going to talk about today, the fact that somehow we need to do better than simply preparing people to pass the examinations that we provide for them as hurdles. So the topic is teach, learn and understand, and I think most of you would assume a continuum. You teach, they learn, and miraculously they understand, right? And that's what we're doing. We're teaching them and they emerge understanding their physiology. And all of us know that that's a lovely picture which we can show the administration when we want to prove to them that we're fulfilling the goals of the university to produce scholarly people, etc. But in reality, it isn't actually like that, is it? Because what actually happens is the examinations get in the road of understanding, and it's often easier just to learn the answers to the questions because its understanding is going to take too much time. And I'll tell you a story about this. Just recently, I was talking to people, I'm not going to tell you what country. I was talking to people at a university, a very, very good university in another country. And in this particular country, there were two very, very good universities that competed for students, but this university was the better one. So the students always went there, and if they couldn't get in there, then they went to the other one. So they made a dreadful error. After 20 or 30 years of basically the same examination questions over and over and over again in physiology, they changed the examination questions. And 30% of the class failed. Because at least 30% had never tried to understand any physiology, but had simply said, okay, if I learn the answers to these questions and can write them down, I'm going to pass. Now, this was a calamity, because the problem was that yes, they had a special exam, and yes, the students then passed. But around the country, all the students now knew that going to that university you might fail. So now their applications were way down, and they were taking the second choice students who were going to the other university. And isn't this a complete disaster in terms of what we're trying to achieve in education? So what we have to do is we have to remember that's how students function, and if we're honest, that's how we functioned. My wife, who knew me well as a student, and unfortunately also remembers what I was like as a student, laughs at me because I now preach something totally different from what I did as a student. I had a very good memory, and it was easier just to remember the stuff, because understanding it was going to take time, and I couldn't be bothered. And remember, we totally overload the students, and they have to have ways to avoid this overloading and use their time very efficiently. So the exams get in the road of understanding. So what we have to do, seriously, we have to rethink the examination side of things. If we're really going to make a difference to student learning, then we have to think seriously about the examination side. Because if we don't, we're not going to get to understanding. And there's another aspect of this, which is that you don't know whether you understand until you explain it to somebody else. And I think all of you who teach, if you're honest, will say, and I'm sure you're all honest, will say, I never really understood physiology till I came to teach it. And then I found out that there was so much I didn't know and didn't understand and had to rethink. So I think we need to try to close this loop with the students and help them to teach each other. That should be part of the process. Now, if we're really going to get understanding, what do we need more than anything else? What do we really require the students to understand? And if we had time, you could all turn to each other and you could talk about this and we could have a wonderful interactive occasion. But you're going to know the answer anyway, so I shall tell you. It requires time to think. Understanding requires thought. And without thought, you can't get understanding. But that's the part we don't leave time for. We're always putting more facts in. We're always trying to teach more. We're not leaving enough time for thinking. And how do you encourage thinking? And the answer to that is really you ask questions. It's the Socratic method, which was actually discovered a few centuries ago, I suspect. But, you know, we seem to have lost sight of that. The best way to learn is to ask questions and think about the answers, because in thinking about the answers, you're thinking about the issue. And I'm going to illustrate this to you in depth in a moment. So, what doesn't encourage thinking? And obviously, passive learning, especially for examinations. And really, honestly, if you asked me to devise a system that would guarantee that the students would forget everything they'd learned within a very short time, I would do what we do with terminal examinations. Because even if you don't think you're doing it, as a student, you're learning it for that date, that hour, that date, and inevitably you forget it. And when I was a student, I played a little game with myself. I didn't like anatomy, but I was very good at it because I had a good memory. And after the 5 terms of anatomy, we had this great examination, and then every week for the next few months, I purposely tried to recall the specific things. And the first week after the exam, I was pretty good. But within 2 or 3 months, I'd virtually forgotten all of it, even though I didn't want to forget it, because I hadn't learnt it in any way that was usable to me in the future. I simply learnt it to pass that exam. So that's a terrible way to encourage students to learn, and we have to try to do something about that. And active learning is certainly one way. And this statement, again, I love the fact that nothing is new. 5th century BC, they knew perfectly well that if you need to really learn something, you've got to be able to do it. You've got to show you can do it, because until you do that, you don't know that you know it. And it's very true. So, you know this, we need to shift to active learning, and we need to ask lots of questions. And this really became very intriguing to me, because if you're going to ask questions, you've got to give immediate feedback. It's no good asking a question and a week later they get the answers, because by then they've forgotten about that and they've gone on to something else. If you're going to ask questions, you've got to have immediate feedback, and it's got to be correct and concise and understandable. So, in LT, we have a really great platform, as most of you know, for delivering this type of active learning and for delivering lots of questions. And it also has powerful analytics, which are going to become also important to us. And people love the platform, as those of you using it will know. But the biggest criticism that I've had going around the world and talking to people is that we don't have enough content. That students love it when they use it, and then they come to another part of the same course where they're not using it, and they're not happy because they would prefer that. So I decided, because I'm completely unrealistic in everything I do, I decided that, okay, I would create a complete physiology course in LT. Thinking to myself, it would take me a few months. I've taught physiology for many years. I know it all, you know. I didn't think I knew it all. But I didn't think it would be so time-consuming. Well, 3 years later, I've almost finished it. But I've learned a lot doing this, and I'm going to share some of this learning with you now. So that's the study guide that I've been working on. And it's designed to meet these goals in learning. Learning has to be efficient. This is from the student perspective. It has to be efficient. If you're going to give them something to do, they have to feel that it's worth doing it because they will be rewarded in some way for the effort. It has to be effective in the sense that they have to understand it. It has to be everlasting, which means when you're learning it, you have to learn it for how you're going to use it in the future, not simply for its own sake. And you have to excite them. Because if you're going to motivate people to learn, and they'll never learn without motivation, they've got to enjoy doing it. They've got to feel it's worth getting up in the morning to do it. So those are the goals that this is designed to meet. And it is designed to do these things, which you can read because I can't read it. And one of the things always to remember is you can read that 3 to 4 times faster than I could read it out to you aloud. So the people who get up with their PowerPoints and read every word on their PowerPoint are not actually helping anybody at all. So you've read it, right? Well, I've been talking, and that's what we're trying to achieve. Okay, now when I started this, I didn't know the answer to that question. And I actually didn't think it would be possible to teach all physiology through just asking questions. And so I started off with quite a bit of writing and some questions. But it turns out, people tell me this, and I believe it, that all around the world, students simply don't read anymore. They don't want to read. And if they do want to read, they don't actually want to read off a screen. Most students still would prefer, if they're going to have to read a book than to read on the screen, just like I would actually. So there's really no point in just putting lots of text onto the screen.
Why do you think that is? It drives me nuts.
Sorry?
Why do you think that is?
Why they don't want to read off the screen?
Or even off instructions on the laboratory.
No, they don't want to read those either, do they? No? Well, I think I blame YouTube. No, because I mean, this is true. A year or two ago, I had to fix a motor mower. So I said to one of my sons, I said, oh, look, I'll go on to the, because I'm very modern, I'll go onto the internet and I'll download the instruction manual. He just looked at me and said, no, he said, just go to YouTube, there'll be a video of how to do it. And there was. And so that's, I think, partly why they don't want to read. It is easier not to read, but to look at a video. And more efficient. So that's part of it, I think, yeah. But certainly if they don't want to read, it doesn't matter where you go in the world, they don't want to read anymore. So, how much physiology? And what it turns out is that any question, anything at all, that can be written down as a statement can actually be turned into a question. And I'm going to illustrate that with a couple of examples. So here's a textbook statement, and that's the same statement put into questions. I'll just scroll down here, I hope. Yeah. Now, there's a number of advantages of doing this. The first thing is they're actually reading the text, but they're reading it to answer the question. There's a purpose in it now. They're not just reading it, they're reading, and as they read it, they're actually thinking about it, because they're having to think, is this correct or is it incorrect? And I was talking before, the students know a lot more physiology than even they think they know. And if you give them the opportunity to think about it as they do it, most of them will get most of this right. And it doesn't matter if you get it wrong, because you can have any number of goes at it. But the fact is you learn from your mistakes. And so by making mistakes, it's actually good for you in your learning, because you go back and get it right. So here's a question. I'm not going to try to get it right, because if I tried to get it right, I would prove to you that I didn't know it. So you could do this, and then you get the answer, and now you get that extra reading that you would have read in the textbook, but now you're reading it with a purpose. You're reading to see whether you were right and why you were right. And you read differently when you do that, because you want to know. Whereas before, you didn't really want to know, it was just there and you read it to try to memorize it. So you can make any question, any statement into a question. And there's another example, a lot of text, but you can make it into questions. So this was my really seminal discovery for myself, was that you can create a whole physiology course basically asking questions in a logical order which the students answer and then get on. So now let's look at the sort of questions that we can ask. And I think there's another example of a textbook exit. I'll just show you this quickly because this is actually quite a good textbook. Not all textbooks are good, and this is actually quite good. There's actually nothing wrong in any of that statement, and the picture is sort of okay. But have a look at the picture. I mean, really, how many students are really going to look carefully at that and understand it? It's there, but it's not going to be looked at much. So there's this text. It goes on and on, you see. Looks sort of okay. And this is what you can turn it into. So now they have to interact with the image. They have to look at it and they have to make a decision about it. And then they have to answer some questions about it. And that is that page from the textbook effectively put in here. Now, when you do the answer, you get additional text. So the total amount of reading that they're going to do is not so much different from what was in the textbook, but it's a different way of learning and reading it and thinking about it. And you can go further and you can go into the second part of that question, which I'm not going to bother you with. But the point is that you can cover all of that in an interactive way like this, and it is much more effective. And the other thing you can do, which is really neat, is if they do want more information, they can get it right away. So you don't have to put this stuff into the main text, but for those who want to read it, it's all there and they can take things further. And if they really get interested, which of course you always hope that they will and very few do, they can even go and find out about Fic. So you can create layered teaching here. And you've got a horizontal theme, but with vertical parts. And so the students perhaps even once may look at this vertical bit. They won't have to look at it again, but those who want it can look once at it, and they can gain additional information. Okay, now I'm very disillusioned about images because I took this straight out of a textbook. And it's quite a pretty picture, you know. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it as a picture. And if you actually could understand it, it's quite a good summary. But, you know, if I gave that to a student, where does the student start? Well, you know, do you start at the top here? Do you start at the bottom? You know, what the hell is going on? And the only way you can find out is to read the text. So you're reading text, and then you're trying to jump down to look at a bit of the image, and then you're jumping back to the text. And it's a very ineffective way of learning. And so most images actually put in like this are counterproductive for most students because they simply get confused. And their immediate reaction when you see this is, it's too difficult for me, right? How many times, seriously, as a student, did you have that feeling? Did you get something and you thought, oh, God, am I really meant to know this? And that's that sort of image. It has that effect on you as a student. So we can do better than that. I mean, if we couldn't, I wouldn't be showing it to you, would I? We can break that down into small steps, each of which they interact with. So we're showing them how to look at the image by telling them, look at this bit first and decide what's happening here. And then when you've done that, and you get immediate feedback when you've done the labeling, then look at this image. The next step, and put that together, and then when you've done that, look at the third image and put that together, and then when you've done that, you can also look to see how sometimes you get nuclear events from that receptor occupancy. So we've broken down receptor occupancy into smaller steps, each one of which they interact with, and each one of which they get feedback about. And then if you want to, you simply take all of those and put them into one big image now and say, okay, you've done all these bits, now here's the whole image, see what you remember. Label the whole image, and I do that sometimes. So if I never now give any image if they don't interact with it in some way. Sometimes the interaction is quite minimal. Yeah.
Question. So basically these three tasks on this page is like labeling, how is this understanding the concept? For me, it's just they need to memorize which structure it is, but without text, they can't understand what's going on.
No, I mean, when you do it, let me show you. So we'll go back up to the top here. So, and again, I'm not going to try and get this right, I'm just going to do some dragging here. But when you do this, and you check the answer, then you get your first description. So effectively, you build up a description of the process, step by step. So you always get a description of what's happening. You don't ever just get the image. Once you've interacted with it, you get the feedback. Yeah. No, it's a good point. Otherwise, of course, you wouldn't learn anything. It would just be a mishmash of images, yeah. Okay, and here's another kind. I won't go, but you know, again, to understand physiology, unfortunately, you need to know some anatomy. And so I've put quite a lot of anatomical background in here. And again, they have to interact and label. And of course, they won't know. I mean, if you see this for the first time, you've got no idea where those things are. So the first time you label it, you're going to get 90% of it wrong. It doesn't matter, because you get feedback and you will eventually label it correctly. And having labeled it correctly, because you've taken time to do it, you will tend to remember it. And so again, you know, then there's a description there of what it's all about. And when you've got a lot of labels, a lot of structures, it's better not to put all the labels in initially, because you've got too many labels. So you can just choose to have relatively few labels initially. You may think that's a lot, but it's relatively few. And then you show them on the next what they've already labelled, and they put the additional labels on. Now, of course, they can look down and see that answer if they want to, but that doesn't matter, because this is not an exam. And if it helps them to do that and they learn it still, that's still learning. So I'm not worried about the fact that they could look there and then go back and put the labels on. They're still interacting, they're still thinking about it, and they're still learning. So labeling images is very powerful, but better still too is interacting with images. So here's an example of what you might read in a textbook. And you've got an image which is all done for you about what goes up and what goes down, right? That's fine. And there's a lot of writing there, isn't there? I find that quite intimidating. But better still, get them to interact with it. The annotate is really good. You go in here, and now you've got to draw arrows. Again, I'm not going to spend time doing this, but I'll draw an arrow just to show what you can do. And you do this, and then when you've finished putting the labels on, then you see what you should have done. And you can compare that with what you've done. So again, you've interacted with it, you've thought about it, you've thought about what's happening here, and then you read that text about what you've just done. But you've already thought about it, and now you're reading it to see if you're right. The annotate's a very powerful tool, actually. I was initially intimidated by it because it's quite hard, particularly on the computer, to necessarily draw the bits you want in the answer. But I overcame that by using arrows and drawing boxes around most things. It's easier than trying to draw circles. I mean, on an iPad it's easier to draw the circle, but on the computer it's not. Okay, now another thing you want to do in physiology a lot is logical sequencing. You want students to be able to say that if we start here, we're going to finish here, and these are the steps between in a logical order. And again, it's easy to construct questions which enable the students to do that. These are arranged in alphabetical order, and you have to drag and drop them into the appropriate order for whatever the question is. And that's another example of the same sort of thing, action potentials. And you've got to get things into the correct order. I think these are very effective questions for understanding, because they really check that your thought processes are not leaving out important steps. And of course, before you do that, you've already had other questions about action potentials. So this is towards the end of that, putting it together and getting them to think about what they've learned. Another type of question is matching questions, where you have, in this case, a hormone, and you have descriptions of what the hormone does, and you have to drag and drop and match the hormone to its action. Again, it's a good way of checking that the students have understood what they've previously learnt about the hormones and giving them a summary of the major effects of the different hormones. So I find that is a good type of question too. And this is another type of matching question which is quite good, where you tell them what might go up or down, and you've got the choices and you have to put those into the logical sequence. And again, this comes after they've studied these things in other ways. This is not the first encounter with the particular hormone in this case. It's a question towards the end to help summarize and check what they've learned. What I've found repeatedly in this is that it is really good to ask about the same thing in different ways. Because you may think you understand it one way, but until you think about it in a different context or another way, you're not sure you've understood it. So this is a very good way to check that you're understanding things as you go through. And then categories is also a good thing. Here's some gastrointestinal hormones, and they belong in different families, and you've got to decide which of the families they belong in. And again, this comes after they've learned something about these hormones anyway. And then if you really want to check understanding at a deeper level, short answer questions are very good, because what I try to do with the short answer questions is say, okay, you've learnt these things. Now see if you can apply what you've learned to a different situation. And you should be able to, because it's not a big step, but it's a good way of checking whether you've understood it. And often these questions will have some clinical or other relevance for them, so that they will be seeing, could I use this? Have I understood it, and can I use it to understand something in the future?
Very hard to get students to put in an answer when they know they can check the answer.
That's fine. I'm not even worried about that. The comment was it's difficult to get them to do the question when they know they can click the answer. But even if they do it that way, the very fact they've read the question, hopefully, before they click the answer, at least means it's in their mind that it's a question. I mean, it's obviously better if they try it first and do it, but they're always going to take shortcuts, so, you know. But you know, what we have to remember, Kevin, is that the students aren't like you and me. They really want to learn.
Often it's just a lack of their own confidence.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But remember, you know, no one else is seeing it. So it's
trying to say that
yeah.
It's just as valid as what the textbook is right for I would write.
Yeah. Here's a good question for you. So they've studied gastric emptying. What sort of food should you eat at a party to delay the gastric emptying and not to get too drunk? And of course the answer is food which contains fat, because fat delays gastric emptying. But I like to put questions like this with practical application in, that they may, from their personal experience, want to know the answer to. Of course, you know, there's two ways to approach a party. One is to get as drunk as possible as quickly as possible, and the other is not to get drunk at all by delaying gastric emptying. And depending on the party, you do one or the other. So I use MCQs the least of all. I think these are completely unsatisfactory and usually don't encourage learning, but simply encourage rote learning and memorizing. And I'm very interested. I read a recent article in one of the medical education journals saying that MCQs are now out of fashion and short answer questions are in fashion, because people have worked out that short answer questions are better if you really want to know what the students know compared with MCQs. So there's a movement against MCQs, which is good. I do have some, but they're the least common questions in this whole course, which I didn't expect when I started. Yeah. Oh yes, you could certainly do that. The point was, if you do have an MCQ, you can always say, why have you chosen that answer? And you can test more understanding that way, absolutely.
Follow it with a short
Yeah, you can follow it up with another question, absolutely. But I suppose really my point about not using MCQs is I don't want only to be teaching factual information here. I want them to try to understand what it is that they're learning. And the MCQs aren't very good for that. So now I've almost done this. My wife's very worried about me. She says, what am I going to do after I've finished? Because it's kept me out of the road for 3 years. And but how are we going to use this? That's really a central question here. And what my hope is that it's going to be used in blended learning. Because I really do believe that the combination of the students working by themselves, or better in a group, but without the teachers, and then coming face to face and interacting with you, and then perhaps having something to follow it up afterwards, that's the ideal structure for learning. You know, don't ever believe that we can get rid of teachers, that online learning is going to be the thing of the future, and everybody will learn the Harvard course because the whole world will have the Harvard course, and they won't need teachers because the Harvard course is so perfect. For one thing, if you actually look at some of the stuff from Harvard and other places, the teaching is abysmal. They haven't got the best teachers. The best teachers are often in places that no one has ever heard of, because those teachers are dedicated to actually teaching. So the idea that the world is going to be all online learning is rubbish. And in any event, although the administration may not like this, the students never came to the university to learn anyway. Not really. They came to grow up. And their excuse for growing up is because I'm going to university. And so they sometimes attend the lectures, they sometimes don't. But, you know, we don't want to fool ourselves about this. The teacher is absolutely essential. And makes all the difference. And I guarantee if I ask any of you, what do you really remember from university? You're going to say, oh, I remember great teaching from X or Y and appalling teaching from A and B, right? The teacher makes a huge impact. So we really need the teachers, yeah. First of all, one of the problems with the online component is we really don't know what to give them to study, but we do know that whatever we give them, they don't do it, right? Almost certainly they come to the face-to-face teaching. If you've given them something in advance, most of them haven't done it, right? Or very cursorily, and they really. So I can guarantee you how not to get them to do anything. If you say, read chapter X in your book, well, what am I meant to be finding out when I read that? What are the specific things you want me to know that you're going to talk about when I read that chapter? I don't know. I'm reading this chapter like in the dark, right? Or, this is even worse, read this exciting new paper. Well, you know, at stage 3 and 5, that's great, and I totally agree with it. But first year students, give them they can't make head or tail of the thing, unless you give them real guidance, which you're not doing. So that's useless too. And even telling them to read is useless. Sticking stuff on Blackboard or Moodle and saying it's all there, you know, they don't, I mean, isn't this true? They don't read it. How many of your students, if you do that, come along having really read it and understood it and being ready to talk about it? And the answer, from my experience anyway, is nobody. But your students may be better, but I doubt it. So, nothing's going to work unless the students believe that you believe in what you're doing. They are guided by you. If you say, I think you should all read something, but you know from your tone of voice and your mannerisms that really it's not worth it, but you're just telling them to do it, they're not going to do it. You've got to believe in what you tell them. And you've got to believe in it yourself. You've really got to believe in that this is a better way to do things. And you've got to make sure that the students get rewarded for the time they spend on it. Because the worst thing we can do is give students stuff to do and it's not in the whatever exam or whatever assessment we have. Because immediately we've told them we don't value it. Because whatever we say, they need to pass this test that you're going to give them. So I've come to this already. You know, the examination, we've got to change that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so here's the course for the future. This is how I envisage the future. We develop our whole education around problems, questions, things that they really will want to know the answer to. And if it's in health sciences, that's easy. You have patient cases. Patient cases just make it so simple. But if it's not health sciences, there's still always good questions about physiology from everyday living that you can build your learning around for the week. So you use specific problems and you have an initial session with them, hopefully in small groups, but it could be in a big class, where you get them to identify the problem and identify what they have to go and learn about it. So you're not saying you go and read this, they're telling you this is what I think I need to go and learn. And that changes the whole perspective because now they own the problem. You don't own the problem. They own the problem. They need to find this out for themselves. And then you use the study guide with all the questions that are built in there to enable them to find the answers to those questions, the fundamental information that they want. And then you have a flipped classroom style session where you interact with them. And basically, if I was running a flipped classroom session, the first 15 minutes of that, I would get them to talk with each other and even make a competition of it about what they've already learned, and then I'd give them new questions, applying what they've learned and getting them to work on those as I went around and interacted with them. So, do we need examinations any longer? And the answer is, in the courses of the future, no. Because in LT, you have very powerful analytics. You will be able to see exactly how long each student has spent on any questions, what they've done, what they've attempted, etc., and what they're having trouble with. The analytics will show you that. So you'll be able to identify from day one the students that are having problems and the students that are coping fine. You'll know that. And building in small tests as they go along, based upon what they're learning, using the same question format that they're learning in, you'll be able to see how they're doing without making a huge hurdle of it. By, in fact, turning it into, let's check how you're getting on. You know, it's a completely low-key thing. But if you use the same questions that they've been preparing, they'll get them right. But also, if they know that you're going to do that, they'll do the study guide questions properly, because there'll be a reward for them in the tests. And then I would actually do, at the end of the year, yes, you could give them another test, because now they're so familiar with it, it's not a major hurdle anymore. They know they're going to pass it because they know the stuff, because that's what they've been doing for the semester. But also you can do student interviews. Now, student interviews are time-consuming, but they're very effective if you want to basically be assured that the students have learned something. And they don't have to be threatening. So I would try to move to that type of system. I would try to move right away from, I know nothing about you, and 6 months later I'm going to find out that you're no good, to a stage where they progress, where the ones that are not performing well are helped, and where everybody is actually feeling that they're learning and understanding. And I believe we can achieve that. And I believe that we can change the way people learn as a consequence. So that's my view of the future. A blank page in which you can create the future that you want. So thank you for listening and your questions along the way. And I shall try not to, I'll try to answer any questions you have now, but I may not succeed.